The snow fell gently over Manhattan, coating the streets in silence as Alexander Grant's limousine pulled into his private driveway. To the world, Alexander was the face of power, a billionaire CEO who commanded respect in every boardroom he entered. His mansion, a glass-walled fortress overlooking the city, stood as a monument to his success. But tonight, success felt hollow. As he stepped out of the car, intent on nothing more than a quiet drink, he noticed something unusual. At the edge of his sprawling property, barely visible under the pale glow of the security lights, stood a small figure. It was a boy. He looked no older than 7, wearing clothes that didn't fit, shoes torn at the seams. His skin was dark against the snow, his breath visible in the freezing air. Yet it wasn't the boy's appearance that stopped Alexander in his tracks. It was his eyes. Wide, frightened, but filled with a strange kind of hope. "Sir," the boy said, his voice trembling, "see, can I sleep in your doghouse tonight?" Alexander blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The doghouse? Down by the garden, his prized Great Dane, Duke, had a custom-built kennel, heated floors, automatic feeders, even its own sound system. And now this child was asking to sleep in it. Alexander's security guards moved forward instinctively, ready to chase the boy away, but Alexander raised a hand, stopping them. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low. The boy clutched a tattered backpack to his chest. "Please," he whispered, "I won't touch anything. I just need somewhere warm." Alexander's chest tightened. "Where are your parents?" The boy's gaze fell. Don't have any," he murmured. "They left. I've been alone since last week." For a man who had built an empire on logic, Alexander felt something unexpected stir inside him. Maybe it was anger, maybe pity, or maybe it was recognition, because years ago he had been that boy, cold, hungry, forgotten. His instinct told him to walk away, to let someone else deal with this. But the boy's words lingered in the air, cutting deeper than any business deal ever could. Alexander knelt, meeting the boy's eyes. "You don't belong in a doghouse," he said quietly. The boy blinked, confused. Alexander turned to his guards. "Bring him inside." The guards hesitated. "Sir?" "I said inside," Alexander repeated, his tone firm. And in that single moment, the cold, untouchable billionaire made a decision that would change everything, for himself, for the boy, and for everyone who would soon hear the story. Because sometimes the smallest request can shatter the tallest walls. The boy's name was Eli. Alexander led him through the towering glass doors of his mansion, a place so grand it could have swallowed 10 of Eli's old neighborhood blocks whole. The marble floors glistened under soft chandelier light, and the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. Eli's eyes darted around, wide with wonder. He had never seen ceilings so high or rooms so big. For a moment he forgot his frozen fingers and empty stomach. Alexander handed his coat to a butler and gestured to one of his staff. "Get him something warm to eat," he ordered. Eli hesitated. I don't want to bother anyone," he mumbled, his voice almost lost in the vastness of the room. Alexander looked down at him, puzzled by the boy's fear of asking for anything more than the bare minimum. "You're not a bother," he said. "You're a guest." Those words seemed foreign to Eli, like a language he had never heard. He nodded slowly and followed a maid toward the kitchen, where the smell of fresh soup made his stomach ache with hunger. As Alexander watched him eat, tiny hands gripping the spoon tightly, he couldn't shake the memory that kept clawing its way to the surface. His own childhood. Cold nights, empty cupboards, the day his mother promised him a better future and never lived long enough to see it. "Sir," one of the guards interrupted his thoughts, stepping closer. "Should we call child services?" Alexander didn't answer immediately. He looked at Eli, who was now curled up in a chair, his head drooping from exhaustion. There was a strange trust in the boy's face, a trust Alexander didn't feel he deserved. "Not yet," Alexander finally said. "He stays here tonight." But that night Alexander couldn't sleep. He stood by his study window, staring at the snow-covered lawn and the doghouse that had brought the boy to his door. Something about Eli didn't add up. So Alexander called one of his private investigators. "I want everything you can find on a boy named Eli," he ordered. He's about 7, no parents, check the shelters, the streets, anywhere. By morning, the report came in, and it hit Alexander like a hammer. Eli wasn't just another homeless boy. He was the son of Marcus Hale, Alexander's former business partner, the man who had betrayed him in the most brutal corporate takeover of his career. Marcus had vanished years ago, bankrupt and disgraced. No one knew he'd had a child. Alexander stared at the report, his hands tightening around the paper. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. And now that boy was sleeping under his roof. Alexander stared at Eli the next morning as the boy sat at the massive dining table, his feet dangling above the floor while he devoured a plate of pancakes. He looked so small, so innocent, nothing like the man whose name haunted Alexander's past. Marcus Hale. Alexander had sworn he'd erased every remnant of that man from his life. And yet here was Eli, the living proof of his enemy's existence, sitting in his mansion and smiling between bites of syrup-drenched pancakes. "Did you sleep well?" Alexander asked, his voice steady but guarded. Eli nodded eagerly. "The bed was so soft, I think it was magic." He grinned, revealing a small gap where a tooth was missing. For a moment, Alexander almost smiled back. Almost. But his mind wouldn't let him. He's Marcus's son. What if he's just like him? Later that day, Alexander met with his head of security, Daniel. "Keep an eye on him," Alexander ordered. Daniel frowned. "Sir, he's a kid. You think he's a threat?" Alexander didn't respond. He couldn't explain it, not yet. All he knew was that letting anyone in, especially someone tied to his greatest betrayal, was dangerous. But Eli was different. When Alexander returned to the living room, he found Eli sitting cross-legged on the floor, petting Duke, the massive Great Dane who usually trusted no one but Alexander. The dog leaned against the boy like they had known each other forever. "You like him?" Alexander asked. Eli looked up, his smile pure. "He's my friend." Something in Alexander's chest shifted. He told himself it was nothing, just a flicker of pity, but the longer he watched the boy, the harder it was to keep the walls up. That night, after putting Eli to bed, Alexander stood in his study, the investigator's report still on his desk. He could turn the boy over to social services, wash his hands of the situation, and pretend none of this ever happened. That was the logical choice. But logic didn't explain why he couldn't forget the way Eli had thanked every single staff member by name, why he'd offered half his dessert to Duke without a second thought, why he'd whispered, "Thank you for not making me sleep in the doghouse," before falling asleep. Alexander poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared at the city lights. For the first time in years, he didn't feel in control. And then, a phone call shattered the silence. It was his investigator. "Sir," the man said, his voice grim, "there's something else you should know. Eli's mother didn't just abandon him. She's missing. And Marcus Hale, he's alive." Alexander froze, his grip tightening on the glass. This was no longer an act of kindness. It was the beginning of a storm. Alexander didn't sleep that night. The words from his investigator replayed in his mind like a broken record. Marcus Hale is alive. By morning, Alexander sat in his study, staring at the roaring fireplace while Eli's laughter echoed faintly from the guest wing. For years, Alexander had convinced himself Marcus was gone for good, a shadow of the past that could no longer touch him. Now, that shadow had a child, and that child was asleep under his roof. When Eli came bounding into the room, holding Duke's oversized leash, he didn't see the conflict in Alexander's eyes. "Mr. Grant," he said shyly, "can we maybe go outside, just for a little while?" Alexander looked at him, at those hopeful eyes. Against every instinct telling him to keep his distance, he nodded. "Put your coat on." They walked the snow-covered garden paths, Eli talking endlessly about Duke, about the stars, about how this was the first time in weeks he'd felt warm. Alexander didn't say much, but he listened, and somewhere between Eli's laughter and his small hand gripping Duke's fur for balance, Alexander felt something he hadn't in years: peace. But it didn't last. That evening, Alexander's phone rang again. The investigator's voice was low and urgent. "Sir, I found proof Marcus has been hiding in Chicago, and he knows Eli's with you." Alexander's blood ran cold. What does he want? "Money," He's desperate. But sir, I don't think it's just about money. He said something strange. He said, tell Alexander to enjoy babysitting my boy while it lasts. Alexander's gaze shifted to Eli, who was asleep on the couch, clutching Duke's paw like it was the safest place in the world. The billionaire who once believed compassion was weakness felt something burn inside him, fierce, protective anger. He realized this wasn't just about helping a homeless child anymore. Eli wasn't a problem to solve. He wasn't a charity case. He was his responsibility now. Alexander knelt beside the boy, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. For the first time in years, Alexander spoke words he didn't plan, words that came from somewhere raw and unguarded. I'm not letting anyone hurt you. Eli stirred but didn't wake. In that quiet moment, something in Alexander changed. He had spent his entire life believing that power came from control, from money, from never letting anyone close enough to matter. But as he looked at the boy who had walked into his life asking to sleep in a doghouse, he realized the truth. Power wasn't what he had built in skyscrapers. It was the promise he had just made. And he intended to keep it, no matter what Marcus Hale had planned. 3 nights later, the storm arrived. Alexander was in his office reviewing contracts when his head of security burst in. Sir, we have a problem, Daniel said, his face tight. Alexander's grip on the papers loosened. What kind of problem? Daniel hesitated. Marcus Hale, he's here. The words were like ice water. Alexander pushed back his chair and strode to the security monitors. There he was, Marcus Hale, standing at the gate of his mansion. He looked older, worn down by years of bad choices, but his eyes still carried that same sly, venomous glint Alexander remembered all too well. Open the gate, Alexander said coldly. Sir, Daniel frowned. I want to hear what he has to say, to my face. Minutes later, Marcus stood in Alexander's grand foyer, snow dripping from his coat, a smirk on his face. Long time, Alex, he sneered. I see you've done well for yourself. Alexander didn't flinch. What do you want, Marcus? Marcus's gaze shifted, just for a second, toward the staircase where Eli had been peeking out, curiosity written across his small face. I think you know, Marcus said. Eli froze when their eyes met, his little body trembling. He didn't run to Marcus. He didn't call him Dad. He just stared like he was looking at a stranger. Marcus chuckled darkly. The boy's mine, Alex, and unless you want the world to see a custody battle that'll burn through even your billions, you'll hand him over. Alexander stepped forward, his jaw set. He's not a bargaining chip. Marcus leaned closer, his voice dropping to a poisonous whisper. Everything's a bargaining chip. You should know that better than anyone. Eli's frightened whisper carried down the stairs. Mr. Grant, I don't want to go. Alexander turned toward the boy, and that was it, the line in the sand. No, Alexander said firmly, his voice echoing through the marble hall. You lost the right to call yourself his father the day you left him in the cold. Marcus's smirk faded, replaced by rage. You think you can steal my son? Alexander didn't back down. No, I'm protecting him from you. For the first time, Marcus faltered. His mouth opened, but no words came. Security escorted him out, but his parting words chilled Alexander to his core. This isn't over. As the heavy doors shut, Eli ran down the stairs and clung to Alexander's leg. The boy's small voice trembled. Are you going to send me away? Alexander knelt, placing a hand on his shoulder. Not a chance, Eli. You're safe here. And in that moment, Alexander knew he wasn't just making a promise. He was declaring war. The night after Marcus's threat, Alexander stood by Eli's door, watching him sleep. The boy was curled up with Duke at his side, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Alexander's mansion was silent, but his mind roared with the weight of a decision. For most of his life, he had built walls of money, power, and control to keep himself untouchable. He had sworn never to let anyone close enough to hurt him. But now, as he looked at Eli, those walls no longer felt like strength. They felt like chains. He walked to his study and poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring out over the city skyline. The world saw him as a titan, a man who crushed rivals and never flinched. But for the first time in years, Alexander realized he didn't care what the world thought. He cared about one boy, and in that quiet, snowy night, Alexander Grant made his choice. The next morning, he called his legal team, his private investigators, and even the city's top child welfare attorney. His instructions were simple. I want custody papers on my desk by the end of the day. I'm not letting Marcus Hale near that boy again. His lawyers exchanged glances. Sir, this could get ugly, Marcus. I don't care, Alexander cut in sharply. Do whatever it takes. Eli stays with me. When Eli came downstairs for breakfast, rubbing his sleepy eyes, Alexander was there waiting. He knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. Eli, he said softly, I need you to know something. No matter what happens, I'm not going to let anyone take you away. You belong here with me, if you want that. Eli blinked, his small hands twisting nervously. You mean it? Alexander smiled for the first time in what felt like years, an unguarded, genuine smile. I do. And then, in the most unexpected moment of his life, the boy threw his arms around him. Thank you, Eli whispered, his voice breaking. In that single embrace, Alexander felt the chains of his past snap. He was no longer just a billionaire protecting his empire. He was a man choosing to protect someone who needed him. By evening, his team filed the paperwork. Marcus could fight, he could threaten, but Alexander wasn't the same man Marcus once betrayed. This time, Alexander wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for family. And nothing, no deal, no court battle, no ghost from the past would stop him. For the first time in years, Alexander Grant didn't just feel in control. He felt alive. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight. Alexander sat at the front, his tailored suit immaculate, but his jaw was tense. Across the room, Marcus Hale slouched in his chair, his smirk gone, replaced with the hollow look of a man who had already lost. Eli sat beside Alexander, clutching his hand tightly. The judge cleared her throat. After reviewing the evidence, it's clear Mr. Grant has provided stability, care, and protection for the child. Marcus Hale has failed to demonstrate the capacity or willingness to provide a safe environment. Therefore, Eli squeezed Alexander's hand. Full legal guardianship is granted to Alexander Grant. The words hit Alexander like a wave. For a moment, he didn't move. He just stared ahead, feeling the weight of every battle he had fought. Every night he had stood by Eli's door to make sure he wasn't afraid. Every memory of his own lonely childhood that had driven him to make this choice. Then he felt Eli's small arms wrap around him. Does this mean I can stay? The boy whispered. Alexander knelt, pulling Eli into a firm embrace. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice low but steady. You're home now. Across the courtroom, Marcus muttered something bitter under his breath, but Alexander didn't hear him. For the first time in years, the bitterness that had lived inside Alexander faded. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about Marcus or the past. It was about Eli. When they left the courthouse, snow was falling lightly, blanketing the city in white. Eli rode in the back of the car with Duke's massive head resting in his lap, laughing softly when the dog nudged him. Alexander glanced at them in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in his life, felt something warm and unfamiliar. Peace. That night, back at the mansion, Alexander walked Eli to his new room. It wasn't just a guest room anymore. It was painted in the boy's favorite colors, filled with books, toys, and a bed so soft it almost looked like a cloud. Eli's eyes widened. This is mine? Alexander smiled. All yours. Eli launched forward, hugging him so tightly it nearly knocked the breath out of him. And in that moment, Alexander Grant, CEO, billionaire, a man who once believed compassion was a weakness, finally understood the truth. Sometimes the greatest power wasn't in building empires. It was in protecting one small, frightened boy who now believed he was safe. As he turned out the light and closed the door, Alexander didn't feel like the same man who had once stood alone in a fortress of glass and steel. For the first time, he didn't feel alone at all. Months passed, and Alexander Grant's mansion no longer felt like a cold fortress of marble and steel. It had transformed into something warmer, something alive. Eli's laughter echoed through the halls now, laughter that even the staff couldn't help but smile at. Duke followed the boy everywhere like a loyal shadow, and Alexander, well, Alexander was different too. The man who once measured life in profits and power now measured it in moments. Breakfasts where Eli told him endless stories about school, evenings where the boy fell asleep on the couch, his head resting against Alexander's arm. Quiet nights when the billionaire would pause in his study, look around, and realize, for the first time, he didn't feel empty. One evening, Alexander stood in the garden, watching Eli run through the snow with Duke. Daniel, his head of security, stepped up beside him. "You've changed, sir," Daniel said with a small smile. Alexander didn't deny it. "I used to think being untouchable was strength," he admitted, "but it was just loneliness with better furniture." Daniel chuckled softly, but Alexander's eyes stayed on Eli. "I thought I was helping him," Alexander continued, his voice quieter now. "But the truth is, he saved me." That night, as they sat by the fire, Eli looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Mr. Grant," he asked softly, "am I really part of your family now?" Alexander didn't answer with words. Instead, he placed his hand on Eli's shoulder and nodded. "You're more than family, Eli. You're my son." For a long moment, Eli just stared at him. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that could break through any wall Alexander had ever built. It was in that moment Alexander realized his legacy wouldn't be the skyscrapers that bore his name or the billions in his accounts. It would be this boy. The child who had once asked if he could sleep in the doghouse, who had walked into his mansion with nothing but hope in his eyes, and who had unknowingly rebuilt Alexander's broken heart. And maybe one day, long after Alexander's name was just another chapter in business textbooks, Eli would remember the man who chose him. A man who learned, far too late but just in time, that love, not power, was the one thing that could never be bought, sold, or stolen. As the fire crackled and the snow fell softly outside, Alexander looked at Eli and whispered to himself, almost in disbelief, "I didn't save him, he saved me." And for the first time in his life, the billionaire finally understood what it meant to be rich. Truly rich.